Well, we are looking forward to engaging in what will be our final lesson on anxiety, though we'll spend the rest of our life trying to apply these truths that we've been looking at over the course of the last couple of weeks. I've taken most of these thoughts from a little book that God allowed me to write a few years ago entitled Safe in the Storm, Biblical Strategies for Overcoming Anxiety. It was a reminder to me as I started to help people wrestle with worry and anxiety that the average person who came to me did not have any idea that the Bible explicitly talked about this issue for them. In fact, we've been looking over the last couple weeks at what David had to say about anxiety in Psalm 37. Last week, we looked at what Peter and Paul had to say about anxiety. Peter in 1 Peter 5:7, casting all your anxieties upon him. And Paul in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, where he said, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. There's one other individual in the biblical record that talks explicitly about anxiety. So think about this for a second. We have been under the instruction regarding anxiety and worry, and I recognize the troublesome time we're in, but under the instruction of King David, the Apostle Peter, and the Apostle Paul, and there's one more, found in Matthew chapter 6. In fact, maybe the best way to say that is we've learned from David, Peter, and Paul, now it's time to do what Jesus did. Jesus not only talked about anxiety in Matthew chapter 6, but he lived that out in a remarkable way. So stay with me through the whole lesson this morning, because at the end of the lesson, we're going to specifically talk about how Jesus lived out these principles in overcoming what could have been potential anxiety for him. Now, in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, that's where I'll pick up the reading. We read, therefore, this is Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount speaking, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? So here's the first lesson that we see about anxiety. Well, before we get there, just let me say that what Jesus is going to talk about in Matthew chapter 6 is particularly specific to two of the issues that our world, particularly as Americans or Westerners, is struggling with right now. The COVID-19 crisis has hit two elements where we tended to feel secure. You ready? In our physical health, and suddenly for the first time we're asking all kinds of questions. If our will is ready, if we've thought through our end-of-the-life plans. And the second place it's hit is our retirement counts or our physical wealth, our physical health and our physical wealth. And because the COVID-19 crisis has hit both of those elements at the same time, maybe you've struggled with anxiety even though you never thought you had before. So here's what I want you to see. Anxiety sets in when we find meaning and security in temporal things. Anxiety sets in when we find meaning and security in temporal things. Now remember, in those other two passages, in 1 Peter 5 and Philippians 4, we found the how-to sections, how to cast our cares, our anxieties upon the Lord, and how to not be anxious. We found the how-to sections in the verses that surrounded that specific passage. And that's the same thing that's happening here. Sometimes we read Matthew 6:25 and we disconnect it from what Jesus is saying in the earlier paragraph. So let me just point that out to you if I could. But before we slip off, this idea of anxiety sets in when we find meaning and security in temporal things. Just let me explain two words to you, the word meaning and the word security. When you think of the word meaning, it's that you find meaning often in the things you want. A person goes out and buys something for themselves because they feel that they will look better in it. They purchase a vehicle not because it's just good transportation, but often because it has the bells and whistles that they want. Meaning is often attached to desires or want. Security, on the other hand, isn't tied so much to our wants, but to our needs. What the text is saying is that, listen, if you mess with your wants, if you place your wants and your needs only in what is temporal, you're going to struggle with anxiety. Okay? And I'll show you that over in Matthew chapter 6. A little earlier, Back up in verse 19, Jesus says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." What Jesus was saying is this. In fact, in the little book, Safe in the Storm, here's how he worded it. The more we accumulate on this earth, the more we will tend to worry that we might lose it. It seems like we should be able to keep our possessions secure, but Jesus' teaching is clear. We cannot. Thieves break in, moths devour, rust destroys the remainder. So much of our time is spent worrying about how we can hold on to something that at best is only temporary. The more we accumulate on earth, the more we will tend to worry that we might lose it. Here is the truth. When you and I place our confidence only in things that are temporary, those temporal things can disappear. And I don't really need to make that point very clearly, because some of you watched this week, all of us watched, as the stock market decreased, investments, college savings for your kids, your retirement funds, those things you just watched them deplete. What took you so long to accumulate only took a week to dissipate. The point is this, that it's not wrong for us to prepare, but if our security is there, we got to know that our security is going to go when the stock market crashes or goes down. Now, I'll note something else in the text a little later in verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body, so if your eye is healthy, our whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Some of you might be saying, Pastor Phil, I have no idea what you just read, all right? Let me see if I can explain it to you another way. The eye is described as what we tend to look at, is what interests us, and we return our gaze to what we desire. In other words, if something comes flying by you while you're driving, you tend to look there, right? Your eye draws your attention to that movement. But if there's something you really desire, you tend to go back to it over and over and over again. You keep looking at what you desire. In fact, I smiled as I read that. This is as I prepared this week for this, because there's a really easy way to know what your eye is looking at. You ready? Sometime today, just pull out your phone and look at your pictures. What is it that you have been taking pictures of, or saving pictures of? What is it that you have been addressing, that you have been seeing and saying, that's what I want to take a picture of because I want to remember it, right? In fact, you don't have to do it on your phone. You can check your Instagram account and probably see the same thing. What is it that you keep wanting to return to? What is it that you're taking pictures of? Here's another idea for you as well. Google's algorithms know what you desire. Did you know that? Like, if you just click on something, that's going to show up in your Facebook account. You're going to see all of a sudden, instantaneously, what it is that you desire. If you keep following a news story, Google's going to say, hey, that's the one they want, and they keep sending you that. The point is this, that whatever the case might be, your life history is beginning to show you things that you desire. Just go back and look. Look with an open mind. Look and say, what have I been looking at? Because where my eye goes, that shows what's going on inside of me. And if you kid yourself and say, well, I just like the good things, but when you actually look at those things and realize there's nothing eternal about them, you'll see that what is inside is truly darkness. I'm going to give you prescriptions that Jesus gives here. So for each one of these anxiety issues, anxiety sets in when we find meaning and security in the temporal things. Here's your prescription. If your priorities are divided, focus on the eternal. If your priorities are divided, focus on the eternal. And Jesus shows us that in Matthew chapter 6. For a little later, he says, no one can serve two masters, for either will hate the one and love the other, or we will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money, or God and mammon. Some translations render, it's either money or the possessions that money can buy. Here's the point. You can't serve both. The idea is this, that we should be thinking in terms of things that are eternal, not temporal. One of the greatest wake-up calls from the COVID-19 crisis could be this, that you could suddenly realize that what you wanted and what you saw as your security base was completely temporal. You and I need to think in terms of what is eternal. Randy Alcorn says it this way. He says, you can't protect it here, but you can send it ahead. Prayerfully think of ways to give what you have away. I've seen a number of our folks have that longing during this time of the crisis, and I'm so encouraged by that. It tells me that they suddenly didn't have a reaction that was restraining, but they had a reaction that was giving. That's how I'd encourage you to think about that during this time. There's your prescription. Your RX is this. If your priorities are divided, focus on the eternal. Here's your second issue. And we find it in Matthew 13. Well, we find it, the second issue here. Let me go back, because I want to show you this great verse. When Jesus, remember in the parable of the various soils, when he tells this first parable, it's one of the few parables in the Bible that he actually gives definition or application to. So when he talks about the seed that is sown among the thorns, this is what he says. The seed that is the gospel, the word of God that is sown among the thorns, and it springs up, but then the thorns choke it out. This is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world, literally the anxieties of the world, and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. That may be one of the strongest condemnations of us in the Western world, in a first world country, possible. That when we have a lot, we begin to think that what we have will satisfy. Jesus says it's deceitful. Riches are deceitful. But not only when we have a lot, but when we have a lot, the more we have, the more we grow anxious, because we tend to care only about what we have. Here's your second idea. Anxiety sets in when we think that tomorrow depends on us more than God's faithfulness. Anxiety sets in when we think that tomorrow depends on us more than God's faithfulness. Look with me at Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. Jesus teaching here again says, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink." Here, future tense, what you will eat tomorrow, what you will drink tomorrow, nor about your body, what you will put on. That is, will you have the right clothes to wear tomorrow? Okay. Verse 26, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they are? I just love that. I can almost picture Jesus there speaking to those who are worried in the Sermon on the Mount. The birds still are kind of flocking and moving around on the bank there of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus says, look at them. Here they are. Look, they have all their needs met. They're not anxious. They're not worried. Why are you so worried? In fact, you might say, but Phil, what if I don't have enough to last my life? What if I don't have the means to make it to the end? What if I don't have a job when this is over? And here's what I just want to remind you. Consider this particular bird, the Arctic tern. Most birds tend to migrate, except penguins, I guess, but most birds tend to migrate at some point during the seasons. The Arctic tern, are you ready for this? Moves from the most northern spot in the hemisphere to the most southern spot in the hemisphere of any of the birds, which means that this bird travels 56,000 miles a year. Okay? Just think about that for a second. The average car, you put about 13,000 miles in your car during the course of a year. But the Arctic tern will travel 56,000 miles in the course of a year. That's not all. All that traveling over the open sea, God provides for him. He doesn't sit up in Greenland and say, hey, it's time to go south. And he's talking to his fellow birds, and the fellow birds say, hey, you think there's going to be enough? No, they just get up and go, right? Trusting that God will provide for them. But that's not all. Think about this with me, if you will. Not only does that particular bird travel 56,000 miles a year, but the Arctic tern can live between 15 and 30 years, okay? They can live 30 years, which means in their lifetime, they will travel 1,680,000 miles. You ready for this? That is to the moon and back 3 times. To the moon and back, this bird will travel 3 times. That's the distance he will travel in his lifetime. And yet, God provides for him everything that he needs. And he isn't filled with anxiety, and he isn't filled with worry, wondering if there will be something tomorrow. Jesus said, listen, if my Father provided for the birds of the air, are you not even more important than they are? In fact, again, in the little book, Safe in the Storm, we wrote, Jesus taught that to worry is to forget the faithfulness of God. So how do you maintain your confidence in God's faithfulness? The same way that Jesus did. You grow in dependence upon the Lord through prayer. This is why the Lord's Prayer, we are encouraged to ask God to give us our daily bread. We shouldn't let more than 24 hours go by without acknowledging our dependence on him. It's a great reminder. Here's your prescription. If you've forgotten God's faithfulness because you're worried about what the future holds, increase your dependence through prayer. If you've forgotten God's faithfulness, he's the one who's been faithful. He's the one who will be faithful. Then increase your dependence on the Lord through prayer. Be anxious for nothing, what you shall eat or what you shall drink. Now think about this for a moment. When the disciples asked Jesus how they should pray, Jesus said, here's how I want you to pray. Give us this day our daily bread. Here's a great question for you. Just think about this. When was the last time that you prayed for God to meet your daily needs as much as you prepared? Like if you've been thinking about where you're going to go out to eat and what you're going to do and what you're going to make, and then prepared it and took all of that time and went to the grocery to get it, which you have to do, right? When was the last time you prayed that much? You see, in biblical times, they wouldn't have had refrigeration. So therefore, they were dependent every single day upon simply what they could harvest or what they could save. They learned to pray daily. But as we acquired all of those technologies around us, refrigeration, water that didn't go bad, all those kinds of things, we suddenly had the means to not depend upon God daily. I have a friend who served as a missionary in Africa years and years ago. He received a call one day that an elephant herd had come into the village, and because he was one of the only ones who had a gun, this is years ago, he was called to the village to take out the bull elephant so the elephant herd would move on. Because if the elephant herd stayed in the village devouring the people's gardens, the entire village would starve to death. Right? They were dependent daily upon the needs, upon what they could simply receive from the Lord. You and I are going to have to work harder at remembering that we've forgotten God's faithfulness. We make so many assumptions. We go to the refrigerator expecting something to be there. We go to the grocery, not so much anymore, but expecting something to be there. In those moments, we should increase our dependence upon the Lord through prayer. If you could pull one thing in your prayer life from the COVID-19 crisis, might it be this, that you would have learned to pray daily, regularly, consistently, always waiting upon the Lord's faithfulness. Here's your third idea that goes with anxiety. Anxiety sets in when our mind is consumed about those things we cannot control. Anxiety sets in when our mind is consumed about those things we cannot control. And we find that in one verse in Matthew chapter 6, verse 27. There Jesus says, "And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life?" And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? Now, some translations render this, "And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single cubit to his height?" Both translations are possible because of the phraseology that's used. It could speak of your height, or it could speak of your life. Either way, it's something that's outside of your control. I grew up in upstate Indiana, and so that's where I was born, and that's where I was raised, and it wasn't until high school that that we moved out of Indiana. So here's the thing. If you grew up in Indiana and that's where you spent your time rurally like I did on a farm, there's one thing you learned how to do besides farm, and that was to play basketball, right? So I remember enjoying the game, longing, dreaming like every other kid who picks up a basketball and starts to shoot, enjoys the game. There was only one problem. I stopped growing in 9th grade. Okay. I would have given anything to have added a cubit, 18 inches to my height. I would have given anything to have added 18 inches to my height, but I couldn't because that's outside of my control. My parents only brought so much to the gene pool, and that's what I was going to be. Here's the point. The same truth applies to your life. If you are worried about whether or not you will live beyond this year, I just want to remind you that's an element outside of your control. If you're really worried today, saying, Phil, if I get this COVID-19, maybe I don't live very long, I just want to remind you that element, adding even a single hour to your span of life, is outside of your control. But here's the great truth. It's not outside of God's. Right? In fact, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a theological tour for just a few minutes. And I'm going to introduce you to some words you may have thought about, but they affect how we look at the character of the Lord. The theological term we use to describe God's control over all creation, just not some things, but over all creation, is sovereignty. Because he preserves, sustains, and governs all events, you can be certain that includes the events of your personal life. Listen, God just isn't a big picture God. He just didn't spin the world into existence and let life start to happen and then walk away. The Bible teaches, you're going to see that in a second, the Bible teaches that God is intimately involved in the details of life. So here's your prescription. Ready? If you're doubting God's sovereignty, remember his attributes and rehearse his promises. Two things. If you're doubting that God is in control and you think that you must be in control, here's the thing I want you to do. Remember his attributes and rehearse his promises. Let me introduce you to sovereignty, first of all, found clear back in Daniel chapter 4. By the way, we draw these definitions and these words directly from the scriptures because it is the Bible that is true, right? Not our experience, that could or could not be true. Not what we know, that could or could not be true. Not what someone else is telling us in the news, that could or could not be true. But the Bible is true. Daniel chapter 4, we read, "For his dominion, that is God's, is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does," are you ready for this? "According to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?'" God is the one, ultimately, who is in charge. And so let me take these three words that go with, well, here's your first one, the word God's sovereignty. Let me give you different aspects of God's character that help you understand and shape out his sovereignty. Here's the first one, God's wisdom. God's wisdom means he knows all things actual and possible and what is best for me. God's wisdom means he knows all things actual and possible and what is best for me. Now, if you have your Bibles, I want you to go with me back to the book of Exodus. Back to the book of Exodus. And here's the story, right? You know that in the book of Exodus, we have the story of Moses who led the people of Israel out of Egypt and was going to take them up to the promised land. That was the goal, right? And God was the one who broke them out after 10 plagues. Pharaoh finally said, "Enough is enough. Go ahead. Go worship your God." And Moses took all of the Israelites and all sorts of other things and left Egypt. But God could have taken them various ways to get down here to Egypt and up here to the Holy Land, following along the Mediterranean Sea. The quickest route would have just been what we call the way of the Philistines. That's because it would have taken them through the Philistine territory, right up along the Mediterranean Sea. There were roads there. There were ways to travel there. But that wasn't how God took them. In fact, we find that in Exodus chapter 13, reading at verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. That was the shortest way, right? For God said, "Lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt." but God led the people around by way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. Watch this. God could have led them this way, but what did God say? I'm not going to lead them that way. Lest they see the war of the Philistines, they grow fearful and they run back to Egypt. God saw something that was possible as an actuality. Now we don't, okay? We don't see it that way. We see possibilities, and those possibilities scare us. But God's wisdom is such that he can see the actual and the possible, all realms of possibility, and what is best for you. For those of you who are Avengers watchers, there's a scene you may remember in one of the Avenger movies where Doctor Strange takes the time stone and looks at millions of considerations in the future, and in one moment says there's only one way that the calamity is stopped and the world returns to normal, and therefore he surrenders the stone, right? And Iron Man says to him, what did you do? Why did you do that? And he says, basically, he's saying, because there's only one way. I've examined all of the future, and I see there's only one way. This is what I want you to see. That's a fictional account, but this is a true account. God actually sees all of your possibilities as if they are actualities. And looking at all of those in his wisdom, he knows what is best for you. Wow. Why are we worried about tomorrow when God knows all of our possibilities as if they are actualities? Here's your next idea. God's providence means he actively sustains, preserves, and governs our world for his purposes. This is great. Let me give you 3 words right here. Sustains, preserves, and governs. This is what is meant by the providence of God. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 1, we find the first one. He, Jesus, is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he, ready for this? Upholds, literally, sustains the universe by the word of his power. Now, the word upholds here, or the word sustains, is the Greek word pharaoh. It's a word that means to carry. When they carried the paralytic to Jesus to be healed, they took him from one location to another. They carried him. Are you with me? That's this word. They upheld him. They sustained him. They took him from one location to another. When God is sustaining the world in which we live, it's a word that means he has complete control over the thing being carried. Just like the paralytic was carried, he couldn't get there on his own. God has complete control over the thing that he's carrying, which is what? The entire universe, okay? It's not enough to say that he knows your possibilities as if they're actualities. He also is sustaining or upholding the entire universe. In fact, because uphold here is in the present participle, it indicates that Jesus, are you ready for this, is continually carrying all things along the way. He is moving things through this world in such a way that he isn't laying it down and saying, I'll get back to that later. Okay? He manages it. He upholds it continually. Here's the next word, preserves. Preserves. Let me give you a wonderful Wayne Grudem quote here about God's providence. God's providence provides a basis for science, believe it or not. God has made and continues to sustain a universe that acts in predictable ways. If God suddenly stopped sustaining the universe, we wouldn't have any way to predict what may happen tomorrow, because science would fall flat if God wasn't providentially working. Here's your second word, he preserves. He preserves. If he should set his heart to it and gather to himself his spirit and his breath, this is Job speaking of God, all flesh would perish together and man would return to dust. Did you realize that it is God who is preserving you? God who is giving you your next breath. Maybe today you're just kind of tuning in. You've not really been a part of church before, but there you are sitting watching for the first time. And maybe you're asking some different questions, like, what happens if the world as I know it ends differently or ends more quickly than I expected? Can I remind you, God is giving you your next breath. In fact, Peter said it this way, with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. He is patient because he doesn't want anyone to perish. God is giving you your next breath today so that you could, in this very moment, just say, Lord, I need to trust you. With this next breath I have, I want to say, I believe, I acknowledge that I have sinned against a holy God, and I want to, with my next breath, say, I believe that Jesus died on the cross for my sins, and with my next breath, I want to say thank you for saving me. Why? Because God is the one who preserves you. He doesn't preserve you for you to spend your life on yourself, but rather for you to turn to him. Finally, this one. God's providence works because of his sustaining preservation, as well as the fact that he governs. The Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom rules over all. God is not rattled by the events of our world. Okay? He is the one whose throne is established, and he is the one whose kingdom rules over all. So we've given you three different words: God's wisdom and God's providence. We've looked at that with three words: sustains, preserves, and governs. Let me give you one last attribute of God that helps me understand how he can be sovereign over all things. It's God's eternality. And that means that he exists outside of time and sees all events equally vividly. God's eternality means that he exists outside of time. Now, you and I exist in time. It's going to take me time to get home this morning. It's going to take you time to do other things this afternoon. We exist in time. But the Bible teaches that God doesn't. In Psalm 90, this is what we read. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations, that is, generations of people. Before the mountains were brought forth, or even you had formed the earth and the world, that is, before creation took place. From everlasting to everlasting, that is, from the Alpha, the beginning, to the Omega, the end, you are God. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. This is amazing. Because God exists outside of time, there is nothing in your future that's going to catch him by surprise. And there is nothing in your past where he's back there wringing his hands saying, oh, what am I going to do? They made this mistake back then, or somebody did this to them back then. How am I going to get their life out here? God sees all of that in such a way that you and I don't need to spend our time worrying or anxious about that. In fact, let me give you just 4 words that for me are red flags. A friend of mine used to say, listen, that's a flag on the field, Phil. When you say that, that's a flag on the field. You violated, okay? Here's the thing. These 4 words flag my tendency to worry. And I'm going to guess they flag yours too. Here they are. The words if only and the words what if. The words if only and the words what if. Now, here's what you got to know. Whenever you use the word if, you're talking about possibility. It's not a certainty, it's a possibility, right? If is a possibility. Now remember, you can't see all of your possibilities, but God in his divine wisdom understands every possibility as if it was an actuality. Therefore, if God sees all of your ifs, okay, not just 1 or 2 of them, not just a few of them, but all of them, if only and what if, God sees all of them. Here's how it works in my life. If only looks at my past, and what if looks at my future. That's why we tend to say, if only I hadn't done that when I was younger. Or if only someone hadn't done that to me when I was younger. Then I wouldn't be where I am today. Here's the beautiful thing about the Bible story. The biblical story, God looks at your past and he redeems your past. He sent Jesus to redeem your past so that whatever you did in your past is redeemed. It is paid for. Whatever happened to you in the past, God is able to take that pain, that suffering, that difficulty, that uncertainty, and he's able to bring you through that in such a way that if you trust him, you can grow more dependently on him, not more anxious about the things of your past. When you use the word if only, you're always looking to the past. But here's what else you need to know. When you use the words what if, you're looking towards the future. What if this happens? What if this doesn't happen? What if someone in our home gets sick? What if my friend gets sick? What if there's not enough money to last through my retirement? What if? This isn't saying that we shouldn't plan accordingly, but it is saying this, that when you and I depend upon everything that we are doing to suffice for the future, we will do nothing but grow anxious because our security is in what we did, not in God's faithfulness. If only looks to my past, what if looks to my future? Both my past, I can't change it, and my future, I can't determine it fully, are outside of my control. They're outside of my control, But here's the great truth. They're not outside of God's. A God who with divine wisdom and eternality and providence is a God who is truly sovereign. That's a God who controls all of those events. Now look back at Jesus' words again. Matthew 6:27. And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? You can't. But you know what? God knows. God determines. God preserves. God sustains. God in his wisdom brings you there. It's a great reminder, isn't it? We're going to have the worship team just sing kind of a little bit of a benediction for us this morning. And then we're going to give you time there around your table in your living room to talk through these 3 prescriptions for anxiety that we gave. And we'll put that slide back up at the end so that you guys can talk through them. Which prescription do you need most right now? Okay? When we talked about anxiety, of the prescriptions Jesus gave, which prescription do you need most right now? Are your priorities divided? Then focus on the eternal. If you've forgotten God's faithfulness, increase your dependence through prayer. And if you're doubting God's sovereignty, remember his attributes and rehearse his promises. Let me give you one last thought before we go. Remember how I said we talk about what Jesus did here at the end? Let me do that with you just in our final moments. Jesus not only remembered his Father's attributes, but at a time where Jesus could have been anxious, we're about to celebrate that Passion Week of Christ, where he comes in applauded, and by the end of the week he's crucified. His popularity just turns completely the other way by the people. And in that moment of time where he could have been anxious about the cross, that was the impending cross that was coming, which he knew was coming, we find that Jesus wasn't anxious. And let me show you how he overcame his anxiety. He did it by remembering the attributes of his Father. That's why in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prays, Abba, Father, I know that all things are possible for you, but not my will, but yours be done. Mark 14:36. Abba, that is the Aramaic for daddy, a term of endearment, one that says, Father, I know you love me. Jesus was saying, listen, Father, I know you love me. All things are possible for you. I know you are powerful enough to do whatever you need to do. Jesus said, I know God's love for me. I know he's powerful enough. I know my Father loves me, and I know he could do it differently. But not my will, but yours be done. But I trust his wisdom. See it? Jesus himself was dependent upon the way he overcame potential anxiety was to remember the attributes of his Father. But not only that, he rehearsed his promises. In fact, if you look back at the Psalms, in Psalm 16, verse 10, David, writing years earlier, says this, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption. Now Jesus, I believe, looked back at this verse as he hung on the cross, because Peter uses this verse when he's preaching in Acts chapter 2 to say, listen, this is what happened to Jesus. But David had said, when he was crucified and when he was in the tomb, Jesus went into the tomb, dying on the cross, knowing that though he went into the tomb, he wouldn't stay there long, because God had promised that he would not allow his Holy One to see corruption. Verse 11, and you make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. I think Jesus remembered on the cross that even though he would die and even though he would go into a tomb, he knew that his Father had promised that the Holy One would not see corruption. And I think the reason Peter preaches that is because after Jesus had risen from the dead, Jesus looked back and probably said to Peter, hey, listen, Peter, have you ever read Psalm 16:10? I wasn't worried when I died. I knew that God would not allow his Holy One to see corruption. But you're close in Psalm 16 to another psalm that we call a prophetic psalm, a messianic psalm, a psalm that speaks of what would happen to Jesus on the cross. One that says over and over again, Psalm 22, they have pierced my hands and feet. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Psalm 22, 16 through 18. And I would make the case that Jesus was clinging, meditating, reflecting on this psalm when he was on the cross. Because not only do those events take place while he's on the cross, so it would have been a natural implication for him, But as he meditated upon that psalm, he comes down to verse 27. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. On the cross, Jesus was meditating upon the promises that his Father had made, and that's why on the cross he would not be anxious. And I can just imagine Jesus on the cross coming to the end of Psalm 22. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that's you and me, that he has done it. And then, as we are prone to do, going right back to the top of the psalm, Psalm 22, verse 1, rehearsing it again, there he would have cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Even Jesus' questions, he didn't ask from an anxious heart. He couched them in the promises of God. Hey, Jesus did it. So can you. So can I. We don't need to be anxious. We can surrender our anxiety to the Lord, remember God's attributes, and rehearse his promises. Take that prescription. You'll find hope with your anxiety.